Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today is going to be a long one, so I'm going to try to make this intro fast. Because it's long, there will be no bonus content at the end, but I would still appreciate you joining and subscribing to the Engineering Politics Locals community. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com and become a member for free, or get a subscriber pass for as little as $2 per month. Or you can use promo code EPFREE for 3 months of the subscriber pass free. That's spelled EPFREE. I'll go over more of where you can find me and support this content after the show. Today I'm talking to James from Commutation Constructs. He is a new creator with his own podcast and locals community. The Commutation Construct Locals community is a free community based around building discussion related to American civics and the economic activity of human interaction. You can find James and join his locals community at commutationconstruct.locals.com. If you like the Engineering Politics Locals community, you'll love the Commutation Construct Locals community too, so go check them out. All right, let's get this started. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. This is going to be another collaboration podcast with another creator from Locals, so it's really exciting. Here today we have James from Commutation Construct, and that is an amazing channel. It's great to go on there and another great community of another creator who is a really bright guy, and his content is original, and it's just a nice place to go to hear more of the people from the greater locals community. So welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin. I'm glad to be here, glad to be able to talk with you. And I appreciate that opening. Yeah,
no problem. And I'll definitely plug more of your stuff at the beginning of the podcast. So we'll get you in there. Don't worry. But how about you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, why did you start your own locals community?
Yeah. So basically, I started my own locals after I suppose I've been thinking about it for a long time, wanting to make some kind of change, give some kind of influence. My whole time as a kid, my mom was just like, oh, you're going to change the world. You're going to change the world, like every mom does. And as I got older, I noticed she always changed to, no, you have to protect yourself. You need to, don't speak out. Don't do this stuff. And I was just like, yeah, I like the first one better. So basically, eventually, I kind of got tired of not being able to have these kind of more in-depth conversations. I want to be able to have more back and forth with people. And I felt once Locals launched, I felt like that was the real way to do it. When I saw Twitter, I was just like, 140 characters, 240, whatever it is, not for me. I'm long-winded. That's never going to work out. I tried talking to people on Facebook, but man, I had fraternity brothers calling me like racist and all this other stuff, trying to like get a crowd against me just because I would disagree about something, or I would question the validity to some kind of like a protest or something. Or a friend would post something like a meme of a whale telling a baby whale that borders are just a figment of your imagination. I'm just like, this is straight propaganda. And when I would point out, oh, this is propaganda, or oh, your Bernie post is like, you're literally quoting a millionaire who has multiple homes going off about how we need to help the poor. I'm just like, you realize the contradictions here. You realize here are multiple parts of where this doesn't actually work out. And for some reason that made me a racist. And I was just like, okay, this is dangerous. I know Locals is set up to be more of a community growth thing. I mean, even if there does end up being toxicity on it eventually, it's designed around being a place for conversation. And I feel like people who are there want to be there. Whereas with Facebook, you kind of end up going face to face with people, whether you like them or not, or if they're just like friends, whatever that meant. So for me, it was a lot of my own intellectual curiosity and wanting to sort of get my own message out there as well. in a way that I felt would be more constructive and less of people trying to just ruin my life and make it so I can never get a job.
Mhm.
Not so great when at my age, I would say, to have that happen. So
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you bring up Bernie Sanders and him being a millionaire. Most people don't know it. What I love about Bernie is you could tell exactly when he became a millionaire because he was like, the millionaires, they're awful people. And then all of a sudden, like one day changed to billionaires. It's like, oh, he just
billionaires.
became a millionaire. So it's pretty obvious. So I
Exactly.
love
And
that.
I think that really fits in with something that our topic for today,
Yeah.
given that we're talking about linguistic manipulation and
Yeah.
and that is that just slight difference at him going from saying millionaires to saying billionaires. He's covering himself up.
Little sleight of hand. That
Little sleight
helps.
of hand, exactly. And people don't really notice because one letter different.
Yeah, exactly. So you already put a pretty good transition in there to get to the main topic, but I do want to ask you this once, just to just build a better understanding, because I think it's good to know where you come from. I'm pretty open. I'm a conservative, although my locals community is not meant to convert people to conservatism. It's meant to understand or better understand conservatism. I think it's really good to kind of get that starting point so people kind of understand where you're coming from. So what would you consider yourself politically?
Politically, I would probably consider myself, well, to put it simply, I'm probably more like libertarian conservative. Not really, I wouldn't say I'm socially conservative. I'm very socially libertarian and laissez-faire with pretty much everything. So,
Good.
but that also falls under the conservative wing of things too. So that's why I
Yeah.
kind of say conservative libertarian, because I'm definitely not an anarchist. I think that's unrealistic. You're just going to create a power vacuum if you do anything. If you try to remove power structures too much, that just creates a vacuum.
Right.
And I try to be more, I guess, considerate of people's individuality and the fact that people aren't rational necessarily um, in my beliefs. And I feel like if you're a libertarian, you're thinking everyone's rational. That's a terrible decision. That's a terrible thought process.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, you're working off of ideals. So I try to have a bit of a realistic look at that. In many ways, I try to see myself as, I see my views basically as being like, I try to interpret what the founders were going for in the U.S. And I would say American traditionalism um, is what I go for
Yeah,
in
that
many
totally
ways.
makes sense. And even talking about, I mean, libertarian is not really in the conservative umbrella, except for it is now because conservatives inherently conserve some things. And this I've ever had this conversation with Dave Rubin, where he says he's a classical liberal. I'm like, well, okay, well, you're conservative now because conservatives need to conserve classical liberalism in order to
Exactly.
be able to oppose something. And if we start to oppose progressivism, I mean, that's just an insane ideology that now, if there's not a strong left-wing ideology, or at least a strong political opposition, the right-wing opposition will also be hurt if they're not going to be able to build any strength or build any rationality. And kind of the rational perspective that you gave, it's not that people don't know how to use reason. It's that we need to go on the assumption that they're actually doing things out of wanting to help people most of the time. So that's kind
Right.
of my base assumption is like, okay, you want to help someone until you show me kind of your hand. And so like, okay, well now it's kind of malicious intent. So now I can kind of go that route. But I would say like you, I try to assume the best. And until you give me something that tells me you're not looking out for the best, or you're not saying what you're trying to say, or you're using linguistic manipulation in order to change the narrative rather than actually be able to make a compelling argument, I think that's where we start to go the wrong way. So
Yeah, of course.
yeah.
And I would, oh, so that was just thought in my head and then disappeared immediately.
That's fine.
Sorry
That'll
about
happen
that.
a lot. Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, so let's get right into it. The topic for today is linguistic propaganda and verbal framing. That sounds really, really smart, and I have no idea what that means. Can you explain it to me?
All right. So when we're talking about linguistic propaganda and verbal framing, it's basically going into the way that media or really anyone presenting information will use specific words to set a tone, to set a preconceived notion in the in the reader's or viewer's mind of what they're saying. So if we want to use our own conversation, for example, so far, when you brought up progressivism, you immediately brought up that it's an insane ideology. So that would be sort of an aspect of framing where we're saying, okay, here is the preconceived belief or preconceived notion about this one aspect.
All right, we had some technical difficulties, and we are going to be going with the rest of this conversation, and we're not going to probably be able to get any video of James talking, which is unfortunate because it was just beautiful poetry in motion. So we would really love to have his face on there, but we're gonna have to go with the voice for now, and we'll make sure to do some follow-up podcasts. We'll get his face on here. So what we're talking about is the verbal framing that I just did with the progressive ideology is an insane ideology, and you were kind of beginning to explain how that is verbal framing.
Right. So when we say insane in relation to something that we oppose, then we're automatically putting it in our viewers' minds that, that thing that we oppose is negative, that it's crazy, insane. It's well, we said insane, so it's literally just something that we that is seen in a negative light, and people will not want to associate with because of the way that we portray it to our audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it as almost a way of kind of bringing everyone up to the history of this thing in one very, very small word. We say insane, so you don't have to go back and look at it as, okay, what does progressivism mean? How far back do I need to dig? We just kind of start out here, as this idea is a bad idea, and let's move forward from here. That's the precondition we set up, and the way I kind of describe the verbal framing is, I would say it's an important characteristic in linguistic manipulation to alter perceived reality. So it's like building a narrative in order to kind of set up the reality moving forward. And I talk about this a lot with psychologist Dan McAdams. He explains the 3 different levels of personality and what kind of controls personality. And he says that, the first level is, the characteristics you're born with that remain unchanged through most of your life. The second level is going to be the learned characteristics throughout your life that do change. So your from lived experience will change. And then the highest level, the one that no one ever pays attention to, is the narrative you tell yourself. And I think this one contributes a lot to it because that's the most powerful tool. If you're going to tell yourself that you're living this particular narrative, you're going to start to view and interact with the world in a different way than someone who might have the exact same interactions, but completely different outcomes just because they believe. Let's use example of me, as a white man. If I have some sort of interaction with a police officer, I might see it as, as police officers just trying to do good and protect the public. And, it might be just, I walk past a police officer and he just gives a nod or a wink at me. I think, okay, this guy trying to protect me. Whereas if you build a narrative for someone else, a person of color, and they see a police officer, wink and nod at them, they're like, oh, they're seeing me as a threat. And now they're looking at me. So it's a completely different reality, even though it's the exact same physical reaction. And I think that's kind of a version of verbal framing where you're now trying to build this narrative and build this reality through a small, concise word.
Right. That reminds me of that concept with the the 2 different movies thing. I think I've heard Tim Pool talk about it. Maybe Jordan Peterson was talking about it before. I'm not sure if it was him. Don't quote me on that. But basically it was, you get 2 people with completely different ideologies in the same movie theater. You have them watch the same movie and they'll both come out telling completely different stories about what just happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a whole key aspect of framing, because people have their own mental framing for what they're talking about, for what they see and what they experience. And everyone takes their surroundings and they organize it in their head in a way that makes sense to them. And often when we get into media and giving information to other people, we will put that framing into whatever we're composing. That's why often people will say there's no such thing as objective reporting, because people are reporting how they see something, how something appears to them. And exactly. We can get into this with some of our examples later on, but
sure. Yeah. Let's jump right into it. You kind of went through some different methods of this verbal framing, and I found them really kind of interesting. So different basically ways you can set up the narrative, different ways you can set up that reality. And I would love to try to go through some today and see if how well the listeners agree, and make sure you guys listening or watching the video make your comments on here, maybe how we might both be right, we might both be wrong, but it's really interesting the way you break these down. So the first method you gave me is something called positives and negatives. Can you explain that for me for a little bit?
Right. So with positives and negatives, I consider this the most common form of linguistic propaganda. I would say that it's generally when people just use terms that are colloquially associated with positive or negative reactions, and they put it into a story that they're sharing. So again, that'd be like with progressives, we could say they're insane, or we could say that they're complex, or they're nuanced, or something like that. Like you could see how, well, technically these things don't contradict each other, but you could use them all to describe possibly the same thing. I'm not trying to pick on you with that, but I just want,
No.
but I think that's something, that's just an example we can have to play devil's advocate a bit. I actually have a list here of a few different type of positive, negative ways that you could frame something. Like,
yeah, and just to jump in real quick, verbal framing is not inherently a bad thing. I mean,
right?
we have to use it. It's kind of like a shorthand language, basically, or again, to get someone caught up on something that they may not have been. They may not have seen before. So you do want to kind of frame up the idea before you continue to talk about the idea. So I definitely don't take offense to the progressivism thing, and I totally stand by it. But I think that's a good example of what you caught me immediately right at the beginning of the podcast to say, hey, this is exactly what we're talking about here, and you just did it. So I think it was really good.
Yeah, and it's your story. And the key thing about this kind of framing is that you want to be very straightforward about it. But there are definitely ways that you could do stuff without even necessarily realizing it. So if we're talking about police officers and them going to arrest someone, if you want to frame it in a positive light, you could say something like the police officers apprehended someone. Apprehended, ooh, that's a fancy word. It sounds nice. It's not harsh. It doesn't have a negative connotation right away. It sounds like, oh, they've captured someone who's bad. But then, on the other hand, if you want to frame it more negatively, you could say the police officers snatched or captured someone. Like they hunted them. It makes it sound like they hunted them down, and not like they're being respectful. Apprehended sounds nice and respectful. Like, oh, they are all buttoned up and they're doing their job and it's good for the community. But then you say captured or snatched, it's just like, oh my gosh, they're taking people off the streets. They're trying to take away people's rights, stuff like that. It's trying to scare people.
Yeah. And I even think, if I were to go up to someone, especially go up to someone in the defund police movement, and I would say a police officer apprehended someone, that's me doing the verbal framing. Apprehended, which is a less pejorative term of arresting someone, basically. So even though these are synonyms, there are definitely different connotations that come with each word. But I tell that to them, and they would try to back the context up a little bit. So they would try to say, well, no, the police are apprehending someone, but you don't understand that the police are inherently bad. So now they're trying to pull back the context to something that is a precondition to the police already, being there apprehending. Well, how did they get there? They got there because some of them are just bad people, or just the institution of police and law enforcement has a really bad history. So they try to say, these are the systems that are getting these people who are being apprehended caught up in there. And I even to go back. Yeah, you can keep going.
Oh, I was just going to say, or they might even reject your use of the word apprehended.
Exactly.
And they may call it something else.
Yeah. And even to back up a little bit, just with the crime thing, I'm reading through, I believe this came from Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, where one of his characters said, they're trying to explain the context of crime and criminals. That I forgot which character it was, but he is trying to explain that, all crime is a protest against some sort of injustice. So he said people are only criminals because there was some sort of injustice that happened to them before they committed this crime. And now he says the crime, instead of actually being a criminal act, is actually just a protest against that injustice. So they believe that something like communism, where you're not going to have these injustices because they're completely eliminated, you're not going to have crime anymore because there's no inherent injustice to protest against. So that's a different way to verbally frame, especially in this kind of an attack. When you even say someone committed a crime, some people will be like, well, again, why is this a crime? There's some sort of injustice leading to this sort of this criminal behavior, or something that we deem as criminal behavior. And it really, they tried to kind of, I would say, more of like a scope drift kind of thing. Where they're going to be trying to play the linguistic game is really what they're trying to do.
And we could get into a whole conversation about communists and anarchists' feelings about some of these types of things. But honestly, if we want to get into that, we would end up going down the rabbit hole.
We have a 15-part series coming up. Don't worry about it, guys. But there's another example that you gave in here, with saying that, you start out the narrative by saying, Black Lives Matter was painted on a street, and then some sort of counter protester came by and started to clean the paint off the street to try to erase Black Lives Matter, right? Is that one
right?
Kind of, can you explain to how that would fit into the positive and negatives linguistic method?
So here's an actual article I read, and basically what they put on their headline is that a vandal desecrated a Black Lives Matter mural, I believe, was basically their framing of it. So in that one statement, you have them both calling you can call them a counter protester, or you could just call them someone painting on the street. And they're saying, oh, they're a vandal. They're causing damage and they're desecrating it. Well, desecration, that has almost a sacrilegious connotation to it. So when people hear desecration, it almost brings out a religious response of, oh my gosh, that's horrible. What are they doing? And then they can follow it up by saying, oh, it's a Black Lives Matter mural. Mural, again, it appeals to almost a religiosity, a sense of sanctity, and that this is a pure thing. This is something to be revered and respected. So you can see in an immediate way where they are saying, even though both parties did the same thing, they wrote on the street, they painted on the street, but the one who wrote Black Lives Matter is sanctified, and the one who just painted over it, or in another case, in that one, that someone just painted over it. In another one, someone basically blotched out the B and the K, and they made it say all lives matter, which I think is pretty clever, actually. Mm-hmm. They readjusted the black to say all. And again, you can see how they might frame that so that the people who are making it all lives matter, the people who are just saying, oh, we don't want this message here, well, suddenly they're made to be evil criminals, sacrilegious. Whereas they make the Black Lives Matter people pure, holy, innocent, wonderful.
Yeah. To me, it's almost like painting. I don't really know if it matters in this context, because some of these cities are like commissioning these Black Lives Matter writings and stuff, or murals. So I think that would be a little different.
Was that one in New York that de Blasio actually helped paint?
Yeah. And in that context, to me, this is almost like I'm graffitiing over the graffiti, and now, being the second person to do it, I'm the criminal, but the first person to do it is the moral high ground, or the virtuous person.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the way that I kind of thought about that specific idea was it sounds like it's reversing the context around. You're assuming the preconditions in any given situation is to attribute positive morality or virtue, in this case to BLM, to a group without question. And therefore, you're making their opposition, in this case the counter-protesters, as the group that lacks morality or virtue. So
exactly, the double standard.
Exactly. You start out with BLM. All right. There's no backstory to them. They're just this really good group. Take my word for it. And we're moving forward with the narrative from here. I
Ignore
kind of
the fact
explained
that they said they're trained Marxists on video.
exactly. Well, that didn't happen. Just we don't.
I did
I don't know
actually
what
see
you're
a
talking
video
about.
where some leaders in Black Lives Matter said that they're trained Marxists because they were
Yeah. No, I'm
someone was
joking. I've heard the
interviewing
same
them.
video.
Yeah, they were asking
Yeah.
like, "Oh, what are your cultural intents? Like, what are you going to do after this or something?" And it's like, "Well, we're
Yeah.
trained Marxists, so."
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, again, it's just interesting that you can. To me, it's kind of like narrowing the scope and kind of explain to you while we were talking before we started the video. Is it's like when you watch a movie, you have the protagonist there and they're the protagonist, but then sometimes you make a second movie that's a prequel that'll kind of explain the background story of the protagonist. And in this particular instance, it's like they're starting the movie of 2020 where you have Black Lives Matter, defund the police, and all of these different protesters that are start out the movie as a protagonist and they just move along. When you got to wait for the prequel to come out to show them, oh, here is the background of some of this stuff. Here is the actual context of what they claim to be fighting for. And a lot of these groups like Black Lives Matter, which often the one characteristic or the one part of their group that they often leave behind is the main thesis, Black Lives Mattering, because it depends on the context in which, there's a life taken in which they actually start to care about it.
Right.
There it's just this background that we kind of just like, well, we're gonna push that aside and we're gonna decide not to focus on that. We're just gonna focus on what they're doing in a vacuum here. And to me, that's obvious verbal framing that's going to be painting these people in a good light, and then anyone countering them, their opposition, in a bad one.
Right. Yeah, and that's I mean that's just a common trick of the media. They like to they they want to put the things that they believe in the positive, and they want to put anything that they could even remotely consider opposition to their beliefs in the negative.
Absolutely.
And I think that's just a common trait of humans in general. I mean, I mean, my family is very conservative, but then they'll flip their principles maybe because they say maybe they're completely anti authoritarian, but then riots happen. They're just like, oh, Trump needs to send in the military. It's just like, hold on a second. You're going against something that you've claimed to be principally against.
Exactly.
So, and then there'll be excuses and things that sort of frame me as being like, oh, you just want the riots to continue. And it's like, that's not true, but it's what you're telling yourself and you're expressing to me and outwardly in order to justify your own thoughts.
Absolutely. And then some of these we'll capture in the next few methods. So I want to make sure we move on and we can talk about the same one for hours. But so
Right,
the
exactly.
second method that you listed is called lying by omission. Can you explain that one a little bit?
Right. So lying by omission, I mean, the name mostly says it all, but it's basically when you have a partial truth, you have, say, a full quote, and you only deliver part of that quote to your audience, or you only, or a study, something like of that nature. Um, my example for this, it comes from the best example I have recently is Jim Acosta from CNN taking out of context the quote of the press secretary saying that science will not stand in the way of reopening schools. Now, immediately he framed that just by taking that quote, he says, and presenting it, it makes it sound like, oh, the press secretary is saying that they're ignoring science in order to open the schools. What the full quote was saying is science will not stand in the way of opening schools because the science will prove to support us in opening the schools.
Yeah, they're certainly in that context framing science as a hurdle to get over rather than a justification tool in the end to prove that it will prove that we should be sending people back to school and doing this type of stuff. So yeah, that's definitely linguistic manipulation of the highest order, I would say, and that's a really good example.
Oh, it definitely is, and it works very well because people who have partial quotes, once people have a short attention span, so once you have part of what the story is, a lot of people will convince themselves that that's the full story, and they won't even bother reapproaching the topic because they think, oh, I already know what this is.
Exactly. I would say one of the most powerful political tools nowadays is the manipulation of data. Data is extremely useful. The problem is, and I think this is a problem that starts in the schools, we don't teach kids how to analyze data.
Oh, not
So
at
I
all.
think what fits in here, the lying by omission, is you take a multivariate problem, right? So you say something inequality. And if you say inequality and you just give only that one variable that these two groups are unequal in the end, that must mean there was something that you have to add to this equation, meaning variables to add to this equation to prove why they're unequal. And what we do is we
Right.
take this multivariate equation, we make all these variables. I mean, there's thousands of variables that go into here, and we make them constants. So we can just throw them out and say, okay, well, we're just going to assume they're constant for everyone. And you only
Yeah.
bring it down to one variable, and you're omitting all of those variables. You bring it down to one variable and say, well, clearly racial inequality is what caused this inequality. Racism caused this inequality. Well, now you
Right.
simplify this equation too much, and the problem is the same mechanism in your brain that says, I see these disparities, and I believe it's racism in the system. The exact same mechanism in your brain, the exact same equation can be used by an actual racist and say, well, no, the only variable in this equation is some sort of genetic component that
Right.
lead to these types of disparities. And it's extremely dangerous to use this type of, this one I would say is much more sinister than the first method. This can
Right.
be used really in really, really poor context and really create bad behaviors.
Right, and that kind of goes in line with what our third topic is going to be. So I'm going to kind of do a little bit of overlap here because this reminds me a lot of the Smithsonian's recent whiteness blog that they put out.
The poster.
It wasn't just a poster. There was a full
Mhm.
article on it where they basically talked about aspects of whiteness, and within it they do have this poster where it's basically talking about time being whiteness, families being a symbol of whiteness. It's just like
The scientific method. I mean, the list goes on. That's. I mean, the poster. I didn't get to read the full blog, but the poster looks like they commissioned Richard Spencer to write it. Like it was that
I
bad.
know, and this is what I was getting at. When you start to when you narrow things down to such a basic view of, oh, there is inequality, therefore it is because, therefore, if that's the only variable, people are going to make up their own assumptions, and a lot of times it'll be whether you are progressive, regressive, or whatever you want to call it, people will end up coming down to answers of either this group is superior, this group is inferior, or this group is doing something to keep this other group down, or this other group is doing something that is keeping them from being lifted up. Either way, you have the inequality, the one who is succeeding is better, and the one who is below is failing. And they're both basically the same idea.
Yeah, and just to get back to this method, so we can go. This is technically the fourth method we have here, but just to elaborate more on what we're talking about, you have the fourth method listed as misattribution of events or tendencies utilizing appeals to authority, not data. So that's basically what you're talking about here, where the way I see it is it's basically the reverse of correlation doesn't equal causation claim. It's you're starting with causation, and now you're trying to assume a correlation to it.
Right. So let me give a little thought on this one.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to put my glasses back on to read this. Misattribution of events or tendency. So yeah, this what I do a lot with this one is also a reliance not even on the lack of data, but on simple like authority figures. Like if you look at the person who wrote White Fragility, for some reason she is seen as a progressive authority figure, and maybe because she admitted her own racism in a giant, very toxic book of just like of white people bad. But
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read the book yet. I've read several excerpts of the book, but
yeah,
I want to find a way to read the book without giving my money to that person because it's just awful. So maybe
I
we should buy one book and just pass it around the community.
yeah, exactly. That's the one thing that's going about with me lately. I'm just like, oh my gosh, she's making all of her money off of conservatives who just want to bash the book.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, it's good to know. It's good to know what your enemy is thinking, basically,
Oh yeah. I have
if
a
you
whole
want to think of it
wall.
in that way.
I have a whole wall of Soviet propaganda that I swear if someone, I just make sure to piece out my purchases on Amazon. So like the FBI is not looking at me like, oh, this dude's just like,
That's pretty
wow. It's
funny.
like trying to recreate it. So yeah,
Yeah.
but
I,
yeah. So yep, you can keep going.
No, I was just saying I'm looking forward to picking up the Communist Manifesto
I've
sometime
got that in
soon,
here.
but I'm still working through a theory of moral sentiments. So I'll get through some Adam Smith work first, and then I'll get to that.
Get a good base. Good idea.
Exactly, exactly.
Awesome. So is there anything else you wanted to talk about when it comes to that misattribution aspect with the lack of data and just saying, again, you're simplifying this equation down to one variable, even though it's a multivariate equation, and how
Well,
dangerous that can be?
well, let's look at COVID for this because this is probably the big one right now, and this uses almost all of these factors. If we want to reference a line by omission, you can point out the fact that, okay, we've got increasing COVID numbers for the past like month and a half, but media and even Fox News, even conservative media, continuously fails to mention the fact that death count is continuing to decline, which shows that we're actually able to treat it now. The people who are getting infected aren't being affected nearly as severely. Symptoms are not as bad as we had thought. And maybe they'll pick out, but they may also pick out, and this will be another misattribution, they'll pick out these one-off events where someone has an incredibly severe reaction, almost like an allergic reaction, where their whole body like gets inflamed and it's almost grotesque in a way.
And
And they'll
they'll
be
do that
like,
with young people to make it a point that young people can get this. Although it's like out of the people,
exactly.
it's still under 1%, and you're more likely to die. I think it's under 18. You're much more likely to die from the common flu than you are COVID. They still like to
Yeah,
pick out those instances to highlight that, oh, you're not safe, So
exactly.
and
Because everyone needs to remember with all these people, it's all about ratings. It's all about ratings, money, and whatever can get them attention. And good news typically does not get attention.
well, it's a little bit of that, and then a little bit of the political slant that's getting put on it. They certainly, and it's pretty obvious, especially people like CNN, which is getting sad now, I think,
Oh my gosh.
especially when you I'm
The
not some
Cuomo
sort of
brothers,
exactly. Well, yeah.
they're like
Oh
a
God, that's
comedy act.
embarrassing. Yeah. But that's the biggest one where they're just bashing Trump all day for his poor response, but Cuomo in New York is just like their savior somehow, and it's this complete just they're not doing their duty. They have no oath to the truth when you're trying to make this comparison and say one is doing amazing and one is doing awful. At worst, you'd say they're both doing amazing or they're both doing awful. Although I would say Cuomo certainly has done things a lot worse that has hurt New York, but they're just not covering it that way, and that's absolutely insane when it comes to
Right.
CNN.
Now, I heard Tim Pool say this, but I haven't verified it myself. He was saying something like 40% of deaths from COVID in the U.S. are still from um, the nursing homes in New York because Cuomo went and put sick patients back into the nursing homes,
Yeah.
which I can't imagine a dumber thing to do than putting the sickest people in in groups in the group that is the most at risk.
Right.
Like
And
that we
a
knew
lot of
that
these
from day one, pretty much.
right. And a lot of these deaths, because I believe the last I heard too was the average death of COVID is higher than the average life expectancy in the U.S. I mean, that kind of tells you something there. I'm not 100% sure if that's right. That's what I heard. So sorry if
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
get fact checked in real time here.
It's definitely anywhere. It's definitely anywhere from like over 60 to over 80. Like
Yeah.
the lowest I think I've ever heard anyone mention deaths being was around like 65, but I think that was in a very like I think that was in like a smaller community or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but so
Exactly.
we're kind of tangented off a little bit there, but approaching the misattribution of events and tendencies to towards appeals to authority. I would just like to look at Dr. Fauci for this. And Dr. Fauci himself has admitted like he doesn't know everything. But the problem is whenever he says one thing, whenever he makes a single claim, it's taken as gospel in many cases. And now Fauci or any of this believe the expert stuff. So believe the WHO, believe Fauci, believe the CDC. Well, you ask 10 different experts, you're getting 10 different opinions. So that's a real issue here because they're not showing the data that the experts are using. They're just saying, hey, expert, what is your opinion of this? And then if they agree, or if the expert is saying something that suits their own narrative, or if they know an expert that will say something that will suit their own narrative, then they will go and specifically find that expert and prop them up as the expert. And I think that is a big issue when it comes to analyzing events, and it's a big part of framing a narrative, because if you have doctors who are saying, well, if you go into lockdown mode, people aren't going to be exposed to as many germs and it's going to cause their immune systems to weaken. So when they go back out later, they're all going to get sick because their bodies are all hindered, they're all weakened. So this was actually a risk with COVID, that we could not only face a second wave, but that the second wave could be magnitudes of more deadly than the original wave, because people were basically just not interacting. They weren't getting their regular vitamin D from going outside. They weren't experiencing the normal amount of germs they do. People were over sanitizing. And not only does that weaken our own immune system, but it also strengthens the viruses and bugs that survive it. So,
right. Yeah, the big thing with experts is you can always find your expert that will give you
support what you
you
say.
want. Exactly.
Exactly.
And I think the expert thing is a good thing to highlight, because in conservative circles, certainly right-wing circles, it's really a good time to make Fauci memes and bash Fauci. Although I really don't find him to have said or done much that has merited that. He's a sinister person. It is the use of him by these media outlets that are really framing this narrative, and not really.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, people take it out on Fauci, but we should be taking it out on the news organizations that use his words as gospel. I mean, he's not the one demanding that his words must be gospel. It's people bringing him on their shows and saying, we must do exactly what he says. Do not question, the Dr. Fauci, you don't want to question.
I fully agree. Because the thing that people don't really think about is, okay, Dr. Fauci is an expert in certain aspects of medicine. Okay, so why are you asking his opinion about what should be done with the whole country? You want to ask him about what should you personally do about medicine? You want to get some recommendations from him? Okay, but when it comes to policy, that doesn't necessarily equate, because from a medical perspective, you don't want to get sick, you don't interact with other people. Simple answer, kind of.
Right.
Or you don't want to spread a disease, you wear a mask. You don't know if you have a disease, you wear a mask. But there's that issue of, okay, well, if everyone's wearing a mask, suddenly the doctors don't have masks. If everyone's wearing masks for prolonged amounts of time, they're suddenly breathing in too much of their own carbon dioxide. So
Right.
that could cause some health issues there. Like Dr. Fauci is focused on a very narrow point, and people aren't realizing, well, we're on a bed of needles. He's just focusing on a point, but we've got all these other aspects that we need to try to balance on.
Absolutely. And yeah,
And
before
I
we
hold
go on
nothing
more,
against
yeah,
Fauci too. I feel
yeah,
I should mention
yeah,
that. Like, I think
I've
he's doing what he believes is right.
yeah, I found the bashing against him to be silly most of the time, and
Yeah,
it hurts your narrative. And I understand it's the opposition of the narrative that they want to push back so hard that they need to create this counter narrative. But sometimes just telling the truth is just, you know, the best way to expose a bad narrative is telling the truth. It's not to create your own counter narrative, and that's a common theme of my show, that I don't need to go crazy on my end in order to expose the crazy on the other end. You know,
right,
keep it
exactly,
civil.
exactly.
So yeah, before we go on another tangent, we should hit the last method that you went through. And this is going to be the third method in our order, and we probably already covered it mostly, but misconstruing facts or saying more than there is. Can you explain that one?
All right. So when it comes to misconstruing facts or saying more than there is, it's basically you take something that is completely factual, an actual like scientific study may have been done or something complete like this. I saw an article recently that did this, and then you attribute something that is found within it, and then you bring it up with something else that people think of as being correlated to it. So in this one article I read, they called it "Cove Idiots." Was their headline started with "Cove Idiots." Study shows that people who don't wear masks and social distance lack brain function. Essentially, that may be a slight paraphrasing, but I just want to shorthand it a little. And the thing was, the study that they talked about never mentioned masks. It also was a study done in early March, before anyone even was getting some solid evidence for anything. It didn't. This was something that was universal among all economic, political, and other groups. It was focused just on social distancing. That people early on, based on whether or not they could cognitively retain multiple different ideas at once, basically determined whether or not they would social distance. That was
Yeah.
that was pretty much the whole of it. And yet you have it being reported that, oh, they're not wearing masks. They're again, the line by omission. They're not mentioning the fact that this was done back in March, when multiple studies were saying, hey, you don't need to socially distance yet, or we don't know what to do yet. This is back when they were saying, oh, you don't need to wear masks, you don't need to do this or that. This was a very early pre-lockdown study, or just as we were entering lockdowns, this study was done.
Yeah, and I think there's a very fine line with this method and the omitting certain aspects method, because this one I would consider basically an intentional scope drift. It's like I'm now trying to conflate two different groups together just because it builds the narrative I want, even though there really is no direct interaction between these groups. There's no direct correlation between these groups. So I'm going to now kind of piece this stuff together to build this narrative. And then on the other hand, you kind of have it the other way, where what I was going to bring up before is when you have experts saying, now I'm losing my train of thought, but experts. So when you go out there and you demand that that the experts must make policy, you're more likely, especially given the American culture where we don't like government telling us what to do. If you're starting to make demands via government, you're going to see everyone do the exact opposite. Like,
Yeah.
honestly, with you're finding problems forcing people to wear masks. Well, guess what? If you from the very beginning said masks will help save you, but we are not going to mandate it, guess what? Just about everyone's going to be wearing a mask. I mean,
Yeah,
that's just the way it would go, because there's no reason to not trust you. But now, since you're forcing it down my throat, it's like, well, now I'm pretty suspicious, so I'm going to do the exact opposite. And that's just inherent in
exactly.
American culture, and that's a great thing about American culture, actually. But you
Yeah.
know, when we try to get it forced down our throat, well, the exact opposite reaction is going to start happening.
Well, and that's the whole issue with like the whole vax and anti-vax thing. Like people who don't you don't need everyone to take a vaccine in order to create a herd immunity where you're basically never going to have an issue with a disease. But if you really start making vaccines mandatory, everyone's going to be like, well, what's in that vaccine?
Mm-hmm.
People are going to start thinking, is that just what you're saying it is? You didn't force the last one. Why are you forcing this? Or even if this is the first time they're doing something, it's just like, why should I trust you that this is 100% good?
Yeah.
It when you force people to do stuff, it builds doubt.
Exactly.
It gives people a reason to question why they don't have an option to not do it. And it makes people think, okay, there is something going on here.
Yeah, and especially it really depends on the culture, because there, a lot of cultures that this would be completely okay with. I would take like the Chinese culture, where it's you kind of tell them what to do, and they're really good at doing it. I think that's why you see such a high population of Chinese people come to America, and they're so successful, because they're really, really good at doing these certain things, because they think kind of linearly that way. And to govern people like that, to just say, hey, do this, they're not going to question it, they're going to go. But I mean, America was kind of built by rebels. This is kind of ingrained in our blood to be like, okay, if you tell me what to do from a position of authority, guess what? I ain't doing it. And I'm giving you the middle finger on the way out. Like that's our culture. That's what we do. So we need to understand the people who are governing us, the people who are supposed to be, our neighbors, being our politicians as well. They should have a better understanding of how to do that.
Right. Exactly. And I feel the same way. I mean, that's why I like to say I'm an American traditionalist. Just like, we got to have some fight in us. That to me, like, that's the American way.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Okay. So we hit all of our points, but I would love to, if you'd be willing to do this at the end for the conclusion of the show, because, well, first I'll ask a few questions, and then maybe we'll get to the final conclusion soon, because I think we're probably running into around an hour now.
Yeah.
Why do you think people use these linguistic manipulation methods? And I'm saying more, I guess, toward the more sinister end. Obviously, like we said in the first one, it's not inherently bad to do some of these things, but we see, especially in our politics, that there obviously is a lot of framing going on to push a certain narrative. Why do you think it's so prevalent, especially today in our politics?
Well, I think with a lot of this stuff, it's kind of innate in us, because in nobody's mind are they the bad guy. That's kind of one of the things. Whenever people have ideas, they like to think that they're in the right, that they're good, that they're heroic, that they're doing something right. Someone who is stealing from you is probably going to be thinking, I'm feeding my family, or I'm feeding myself. Like, I'm doing what needs to be done to survive. So people naturally use a lot of these framing things just almost so they can live with themselves, and it helps them cover up a lot of their own sort of, I'm not going to say lack of principles, but their own hypocrisy in some of their principles, where they're able to basically excuse some bad behavior or certain things in order to get what they want, essentially. So I think that's a reason why people do this in general. And when it's becoming a lot more prevalent, I think, just because in some cases people are really mastering using multiple of these different methods and aspects together. So like when we were talking about a lot of the studies and examples we had, the articles, we would talk about, oh, well, this is kind of a combination of 2 or 3 of these, maybe even 4. I mean, positives and negatives is basically in every form of linguistic propaganda or framing, the verbal framing. So when people are more heated, I think social media has definitely gotten people to be kind of always on, and they're always triggered, for lack of a better word, just on high alert, and constantly thinking about all of these different aspects. And people are being faced with more opposition than ever before. You're not just in your community believing what you and your community believes. You're now facing people telling you that you are wrong every single day from all over, and it's continuous, it's constant. And now people are just like, I think that is trouble for people, because I think people have a hard time, and this is just my own thought on it, I think people have a hard time being able to come to terms with the fact that other people think that they're the bad guy. So when it comes down to it, I think a lot of these people end up, and a lot of these media outlets end up saying things that are to almost make themselves feel good, to justify themselves, and to try to get more people to vouch for them, because they're receiving so much hatred. They want to receive the support to kind of solidify themselves and feel like they are still good, despite all these people telling them that they're bad.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about right there is moral framing. I mean, we see this when you must dictate the other side as evil in order to make your side more appealing. I mean, and we see this, both sides do it, but we certainly see it with what I would say kind of that Bernie bro progressive side, where the ideology not only works more efficiently when you can categorize anyone who makes over some sort of specified amount of money as evil, it demands it. Like in order for that ideology to thrive, you must be able to categorize the other side in some sort of negative moral light.
Right. So I'm actually going to reference a conversation I had with my friend with this, because when I grew up, so I was born in New York and I grew up in Georgia. And even though I grew up in Georgia from the time I entered elementary school, I started kindergarten there. I was always considered the Yankee. Just no matter what. To the day I graduated high school, I was the Yankee in my school. So that always kind of gave me this perspective of like feeling like an outsider there. It always left me feeling like there is some differentiation, and almost like I was someone just seeing what was happening. And I realized, to me, growing up, there was a lot of pressure from a lot of conservatives to sort of be moralistic or in line with their moralistic views. And to an extent, I see this far left kind of craziness as a backlash to that. Because I remember back in the early 2000s, people were trying to ban Harry Potter for teaching kids witchcraft, which is like, I thought Christians don't even believe witchcraft exists. That was like, I was just like, we all know that this is fake, right? Like, you're not teaching a kid witchcraft if witchcraft doesn't exist. But I always saw that growing up, and I guess I was always just a live and let live person. So to me, that was just like, okay, here's this people trying to force a kind of moral position on me. So maybe that's why I'm a rebel with everyone at this point. And then I see the left do a lot of things, the illiberals, and I see a lot of what they do as almost like a reverb to it. Like, you send a shockwave in one way, and then a bigger one comes back. That's kind of the way I see this going right now. Kind of like you take a slinky or something, you shake it one direction, and then you shake it back harder the other way, and it goes back and forth and builds up over time. That's kind of a way I see it. And I remember thinking this when I was talking to one of my friends, because one of my friends is like totally pro trans or whatever, and I don't even want to get into details of what he was telling me, because some of it was honestly gross and TMI. But like, he isn't trans, but he's dating a trans person, so he has all this emotional investment in it. And I basically turned to him, I was just like, so trans people are now almost completely taking over the LG part of LGBT. or maybe the LGB, they're kind of taking over. Because like, and you have stuff like TERFs and stuff like that. I'm just like, are you not worried that the trans people being so forceful with what they're doing is going to cause a backlash against all of LGBT? Are you not worried that there is going to be a backlash that not people in most cases don't care about gay people right now? But if you go too far with the T stuff, people might backlash against all of it, and you could undo all of your progress. Do you not have any kind of apprehension about that? And he flat out denied it because he's gone totally cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs with all this stuff. Another framing right there.
Hey, we don't swear on this show. You got to watch your language.
Yes. But when I went through that, just like I just sort of see the left now being the ones doing the big swing on it, and I want to bring up a lot of this conversation about the linguistic propaganda and verbal framing to try to just like steady the slinky, I guess you could say, is sort of where I'm coming at this from.
Good. All right. Well, since we're probably running up a pretty long time now, basically my last question is, how do we fight against these more malicious forms of verbal framing and this linguistic propaganda?
Yeah. So how we fight against it, for one thing, we need to be honest about our own biases. I think that is one of the most important things. If you create a news network, if you talk to people, be honest about what you are. That is definitely key, because when people know where people are coming from, it can ease the tension. I'm reading a book called Never Split the Difference. It's a book about negotiating, and one of the things they do is a good way to sort of break the ice is to do a self-audit. Admit not necessarily your faults, or things that might not necessarily be faults, but things that could create tension between the two parties. Admit that right up front. Be honest about it and get it out of the way. And let people know early on, I just want to be fair here. Here are my thoughts. Because you don't want someone to respond to you by saying, but you don't want someone to respond to something you say by saying you're not being fair, because then it becomes a whole moral back and forth. If you bring up fairness up front, if you bring up your quote unquote faults or just your tension aspects up front, and then you let people know, I just want to be fair to the situation. Let me know if you feel like I'm not doing that or if I'm setting the wrong footing here. Get that out of the way up front, and then you can have a much more cohesive conversation. And I think that's really important. And the other aspect is we really need to just call out when we see this linguistic propaganda and verbal framing to such an extreme extent, to the extent that we see it in places like news articles or reporters, stuff like that. We really need to call this stuff out. That's definitely key to it. And be prepared to be taken out of context. You got to prepare for it. That's a really big part of it, because if you happen to blow up a little bit, then people are going to be coming for you from every which angle, and you need to be prepared emotionally and mentally to realize so many people are going to think that you're a bad guy. About maybe even half the people you talk to are going to be saying you're the bad guy. And if it blows up in one of their circles and not one of the ones that align with you, it's going to be a lot worse than that. And you got to be prepared for that. And you got to be prepared to be like, to introduce those people in a calm and positive way to something that contests with them without attacking them. You want to try to avoid attacking. That's a big deal with it.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, there it is. We laughed, we cried. It was a great podcast. James, thank you very much for coming on. I hope you come on again. But before we leave, let everyone know where you can be found.
Yeah, thank you for having me. You can find me at commutationconstruct.locals.com. I also have a small blog that I run at commutationconstruct.com. We'll have links to it so that you guys don't have to spell it too much. But that's where you can find me. I don't have other social medias that I really work with. I might get on top of that sooner rather than later, but for now, that's it. And you can also email me at james@commutationconstruct.com, or let's just leave it at that. I think that covers most of it, and we'll provide links.
Excellent. Yeah. So if you're watching this in the Engineering Politics Locals community, James is super active on there. If you like my stuff, you're going to love his stuff. Obviously, a really smart guy. So please go over to his locals community, become a member, become a subscriber, support the content so we can start having more awesome conversations like these. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to make sure to plug all the stuff in the bottom. So I'll give you all the appropriate links. So James, again, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I really hope you come back on, and this is it. Congratulations, buddy.
I love it. Hopefully my camera will be working next time. I'm going to make sure to get one that I can plug in, because this one in my computer is just, the Lenovo just isn't working for me anymore. I think something got loose in there. Don't know what it is, but
no problem. You're just going to have to send us a still photo with like these nice spectacles and a pipe and stuff and make it really smart. We'll be good.
Yes.
We'll find a way. Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Great. Have a good one.
Cool. You too. All right. There it is. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Make sure to join the Commutation Construct Locals community and show James some support. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to take a quick moment to share different ways you can help support this content. There are a few easy ways to do this. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can give me a follow on Parler at Engineering Politics. You can join the Facebook group named Engineering Politics, where I share and discuss content with the Facebook community. You can also subscribe to my video channel on YouTube under the channel name Engineering Politics, where you can find the video version of each podcast. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging the trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can find all of my podcasts and videos on there as well. But the best way to interact with me, get the newest content, and support this podcast is the Engineering Politics Locals community. This is an amazing community that goes far beyond just a membership platform intermediary for creators. It allows followers of this content to get together and discuss the newest articles, podcasts, and videos all in one place. I strongly urge you to join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a subscriber if you use promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. Monthly subscriptions to the Engineering Politics Locals community start as low as $2 per month. So I hope I can count on your support so I can start making higher quality podcasts and subscriber content like the bonus content at the end of most shows, and the new video series, the EP Zone, available only in the Engineering Politics Locals community with a subscription pass. I appreciate your consideration. Let's build a community together. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.